You may be wondering how those two clips relate to one another, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you'll have a better idea. Hi everybody, this is Mr. Jourdan. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. Today I have to take my oldest son to get braces, which I'm sure he's looking forward to. And so rather than waste the day, I thought we could knock off one of the presentations that I wanted to show you. If you're interested, you can go online and find a copy of this presentation on my website under the Progressive Era unit. As you go through and you're not sure you understand something, what you can do is you can take note of the questions and we can review them together once we get back together in class. So what we're going to be talking about today is The Wizard of Oz as a populist fable. Before we begin going into how The Wizard of Oz is a fable, it's probably helpful to know what a fable is. A fable is a story that tries to teach people a lesson, much like Aesop's fables, telling people not to be jealous or not to brag about your accomplishments. Fables are not just in children's stories, but they're used all the time. Science fiction particularly uses a lot of fables. The Lord of the Rings was written by J.R.R. Tolkien as a fable against National Socialism, the Nazis, who were coming to power in Europe at the time of his writing. Batman, The Dark Knight, is about the idea of the power of one person who stands up against a corrupt system. And so although we may not be prepared to go to the lengths Batman goes to do the right thing, maybe it encourages us to do a little bit of something. Another science fiction example is an episode of Star Trek from the 1960s. During the 1960s, the U.S. was going through the civil rights era, and many people in the American South obviously rejected civil rights, African American civil rights. In one episode of Star Trek, Kirk and Spock go to a planet which is at war with one another. Half of the population is black on the left side and white on the right side. And they're fighting another population that's white on the left side, black on the right side. And what this episode was trying to show was how stupid racism is. The fable that we'll be talking about today, though, is a fable written by L. Frank Baum. L. Frank Baum is the writer of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He wrote it as a statement of his political beliefs in a movement known as populism. Populism was especially popular in the Midwest, where L. Frank Baum was from. It's no accident, of course, that the main character in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, comes from Kansas. L. Frank Baum wanted to use a children's story for a couple of reasons. The first is by appealing to kids, you can influence them when they're younger. And the other thing is by using the story of a children's story, you might be able to say something more daring than you would have been able to if it were just stated directly. Also, you might get a larger audience as well. People usually don't want to read political diatribes about populism. So, The Wizard of Oz is published in 1900 by L. Frank Baum. And much of what we'll be saying deals with both the movie and the book, although there's some minor differences between the two. So let's first define what populism is. Populism is an 1890s revolt of the rural poor against the money power. It's an organization of farmers against the big corporations. Here's a little background. In 1873, a panic swept the United States. It would be considered the worst economic crisis in American history until the Great Depression. Everywhere you turned to in America, people were thrown out of work. But perhaps the most hardest hit were America's farmers. Today, farmers are probably less than 5% of the American population. But in the late 1800s, they made up a majority of the population, and they were really struggling. Farmers make money by selling their goods in market. And if we looked in 1873, a farmer earned $1.21 per bushel of wheat that he sold. In 1885, that number had declined to 49 cents. In 1873, farmers earned only 25 cents per pound of cotton that they picked. In 1885, that was down to 5 cents. So what was going on? At the same time that income was down, expenses were up. Their expenses, and their most important expenses, railroad rates, went up. The railroads were largely financed through government grants of land and cheap loans. Yet the railroads didn't pass these savings on to the average American. They charged very, very expensive rates for farmers. Farmers had no value, their crops had no value if they could not get them to market. So if railroad rates went up, farmers essentially just had to pay. In addition, other things that farmers needed to buy, equipment, seed, fertilizer, and even just household goods, had gone up in prices. In the late 1800s, farmers were stuck in a vicious cycle. The cycle was that more and more people were planting land, further and further cultivating the acreages that they owned. This was owed to the fact that you had better machinery. John Deere created the mechanical reaper, and as a result, something called a combine was developed. A combine allowed farmers to use one machine to plant, weed, and eventually harvest their crops. And they could do so many acres in a day. In fact, they could grow much more than they could prior to its invention. But under the iron law of supply and demand, we know that when a supply of something goes up, the price falls. So farmers were planting more land and using farm equipment to make it easier on themselves. And at the same time, it was affecting their price. Well, the dilemma that farmers faced is that farmers had to either buy this expensive equipment or they would fall behind because everyone else was buying the equipment and planting more and more acres. These pieces of equipment were incredibly expensive. Today, a good combine could cost a farmer as much as $2.5 million. Farmers own a lot of land, but they don't have a lot of money. So in order to buy this equipment, many farmers had to take out loans. But the loans were based on the previous prices of crops. When farmers bought their crops, or bought their combines, I should say, they were buying it with the understanding that wheat might fetch a certain price per bushel. But each year, the amount of money that farmers made on a bushel of wheat fell, which meant that they had almost no means of paying back these loans. So a lot of the situation that farmers were dealing with in the late 1890s is going on today with many homeowners. A lot of American homeowners are what's called underwater with their mortgages. It means that they owe the bank more for their home than it's actually worth. And it means that they're pretty much stuck with it. They can't sell the home because they owe more to the bank than they'd actually get in a sale. And so many people begin to foreclose or give up their homes in foreclosure, and the banks take it over. And as the banks take over their homes, all the other homes in their area go further down in value, and as a result, more homes get foreclosed. It's a vicious cycle, and it's much like the cycle that farmers faced in the late 1800s.